I was going to say a game of three halves, which is why Anita is going to be doing the numbers and not me. So I'm just doing a bit of the intro about why we came together and what we've done before Candace and Anita talking a bit more about some of the results. So this morning, Nigel said that the three think tanks sometimes come together to speak with one voice. We do. We don't actually do it very often. We did it last autumn on the workforce issue, trying to raise the focus and the attention and indeed to try and provoke some focus for the long-term plan. That was a fairly short piece of work. And I want to say why we did it. All three of us, and I don't mean just the three that you've got on the stage, but us in our various organisations. The number of times when we're out now in the NHS, in social care, in generally the service, whether it's the private sector, the VCSE, that workforce keeps on coming to the top. And you can have a conversation around integrated care, you can have a conversation around access in social care, and again and again and again, workforce just came to the top of the agenda. And at the same time, we are seeing a long-term plan being put together. Great that there's more money, but if you're already building on very shaky foundations on the workforce, exactly how was that money going to transfer into better services and better care, given the context on the workforce? So having said we sometimes come together, this piece is very, very different to what we normally do. We'll publish fairly soon, and what you'll notice, it's an enormous document. So we haven't succeeded too greatly on managing the length, but we will have a short piece at the front. We've really come together to try and kind of put a bit of muscle from our three organisations. We're not that big, despite what many people think. And what we've really tried to focus on is not so much rehearsing the challenge. There is a little bit of that, of course. Not so much on rehearsing how we got there, but really tried to focus on what you could do about it. So whether it's around issues to do with training, issues to do with making the NHS a good employer, something on international recruitment, we've tried to do something that we hope will be helpful. We've drawn on the three organisations. Quite a few people in the room may have been involved in some of our workshops. We've also pulled on contacts with professional bodies. We've been feeding in to the national NHS bodies as we go, and we're now doing so again. Some of us in the room now, I think, were in the King's Fund yesterday with Dido Harding, Julian Hartley, David Bean and others trying to work on the workforce implementation plan. So we are walking in step with the pieces that the NHS are doing. The strange thing, both at that session yesterday, that I'm going to do again now, is to tell you what it isn't. What we've really found and really felt is the amount of time that's gone by while we've been moving into a worsening workforce crisis, have built up a really long set of lists of very critical and important issues that we're going to need to deal with. And not we, but I mean people in this room, the national NHS bodies, professions and others. There is no way that our three organisations could come up with an answer to that. And I strongly suspect that Dido and others are going to have many bites of the cherry. This is going to be a process of turning around the workforce crisis that we're in. So this is a contribution, but it is not the answer. And on that, I should say, picking up on some of the things that Natasha spoke about on social care, we have included social care. We passionately believe if you're going to do workforce, it needs to be health, it needs to be social care, and indeed it should look at the assets in the community as it does it. But social care remains in a critically different place. If you haven't sorted out the money, sorting out the workforce is extremely difficult to do. So, trying to disappoint you in advance, we don't go as far on social care as we do on the health workforce, but that's absolutely, as I say, if you can't sort out the funding issue, it's very difficult for local authorities and for social care providers to pay or to improve the lot of many of their social care staff. So I shall stop saying what isn't in it and instead pass over to Candace with some of the things that are in it. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. So we're going to begin with just a quick recap on the challenges. This is the paper that Richard was referring to that we published in November. Hopefully most of you clocked it. And it made the unequivocal statement that in our view, workforce is now a bigger threat than the money. We described the gap we currently have and importantly described the gap we will have if nothing is done. And that is an incredibly important journey to understand. And for me, one of the big issues is getting the urgency out there, a bit like we were talking about in social care, that this is going to be a really big problem if we don't sort it. We're putting good money after bad at the minute with the huge amount of money that's going on our temporary staff as a consequence of those gaps. We talked about social care. It's already threatening the quality and sustainability of services, and the CQC picked it up in their report, and it's already having a significant toll on the health and well-being in staff, as the recent staff survey has shown us. So how did we get here? A very quick canter through this, if my slide will move forward. Crucially, this fragmentation of responsibility around the workforce. NHS providers did a fabulous report laying out that complete discontinuity, and indeed the Health Foundation also did a piece on this. Poor, and I've specifically put in the word constrained workforce planning because the interlinking between financial projections and workforce projections is really, really problematic when it comes to workforce planning. If you constrain your sites by a financial envelope, you get into trouble, which is what we did with nursing. And we've seen a real raiding of the workforce budget, which in my view is totally unforgivable. £2 billion whisked away, and of course it didn't hit the headline NHSE figure, and that of course is partly accounted for by bursaries, etc. We've got Brexit and immigration policies which are already pulling our workforce from the EU away from us. And we've had declining rates of retention, which is something anyone in a hospital will be well aware of. And growing numbers of clinical staff leaving the NHS before retirement. Really quite dramatic changes here in terms of the age at which people are leaving, and of course pension policies haven't helped us. So the long-term plan response, I suppose in a word or in a few words, was a plan for a plan when it comes to workforce. It signalled the workforce implementation plan that Richard was just talking about, and it had lots of good stuff in it. But our fundamental critique of this when we looked at it last November was that our real concern was that it would be just a wish list of a plan if it didn't have money and action to support workforce. And so far, we are seeing neither. We've got delay, courtesy of now having to wait for a workforce plan to figure out what's going to come next. And we've got resourcing, crucially, being dependent on the spending review. And we've got to essentially flip as a system from what feels to many people at the minute, and I was presenting to some HR directors literally only yesterday, and they talked about this vicious cycle, the cycle where staff, particularly nurses on the front line, are faced with fewer people coming in, a higher workload. They're then more burnt out, they're more likely to leave, and indeed trainees are more likely to leave and not stay the course. You're getting poorer outcomes too, because we've got really compelling evidence about the link between trained staff and outcomes in patient care. And we've somehow got to switch that into the positive, virtuous cycle where actually people are attracted in, we get the better outcomes, the more advocacy, and crucially, to get that, we've got to invest in our workforce. And that investment is something that the centre doesn't seem to get, how utterly critical it is. And if they don't make it, that vicious cycle will play out really quite dramatically. So I'm going to begin with looking at some of the issues around nurse training. And interestingly, we've had a bit of what has turned out to be an own goal in this area. So we went from a scenario where nurses were able to get bursaries and have their fees paid. Now they may be able to get a loan for living costs, and they have to pay up to £9,000 for their tuition fees. And perhaps not surprisingly, we've seen numbers fall, and that's in sharp comparison to other places in the UK which have held on to bursaries and actually seen some growth in the nursing workforce. And it's also helpful, I think, to recognise that it need not be like this. So here's Australia, where again they took action and did things to encourage people to go into their nurse training, including actually getting people from abroad to train in Australia, and saw this incredible growth in nursing trainees. And one of our other challenges around nursing is what happens in that training pipeline. And I think one of the things that government was wooed by when it thought it could get rid of bursaries was the fact that many more people, the top number there, 57,000, apply to go into nursing than actually then get accepted. They thought, well, you know, we've got excess demand here, so we can afford to not create so many incentives. But actually, crucially, we then also lose people through the pipeline. And so for every 5 persons starting, only 3 join the NHS. The other thing that's been an issue have been clinical placements. And here there's a really stark difference between nursing and medicine, where you only get £4,000 for hosting a nurse, you get £44,000 for some of your medical placements. And perhaps not surprisingly, there's not a huge incentive for trusts to take those nurses on. So international recruitment. Now this is quite a problematic area. We heard earlier that we are increasingly competing internationally. Everyone has got deficits around staffing. The numbers literally amount to the millions when you go globally, as the WHO reports will show you. But it, in the short term, is possibly one of the few places that we can go, but we are very mindful of the ethical issues that sit around this. Though we're also conscious that we seem to have gone from a scenario where we were quite well organised around international recruitment, and indeed in 2002 we managed to have 16,000 nurses join the NHS from outside the UK, which was actually more than we trained ourselves. In 2017-18, it was only 5,000, of which only 900 at that point were from the EU. It had been up at 9,000 before Brexit hit. And there are things that we could do to make this recruitment hugely easier, but it requires cross-government action. So we've got bizarre things like the fact that child and adolescent psychiatry isn't on the shortage occupation list. And then, of course, there's the growing concern about a 30,000 threshold, which is very significant if you're thinking about roles in the care sector. And then we've got retention and engagement. So the leaking bucket of workforce, those people leaving the NHS early, we've crucially got to hold on to them. And early career and retirement are key. If you look at the rates at which people leave, it's a U-shaped curve with bigger numbers at the beginning and big numbers at the end. So we need support for early career. I will never forget the experience at a hospital going on and talking to grade 5 nurses who had just come on to a very heavy duty medical ward and were literally in tears because they could not cope with the work. They crucially needed support and supervision. And then, of course, retirement, the pension policy, a total ongoing. 62% of GPs have been taking voluntary early retirement versus a rate of 33% about 8 years earlier. So we are watching a hemorrhaging not helped by this. So there's all sorts of things you can do. This is no silver bullet in this area. CPD, continuing professional development, is a really key part of this, and a big message from us is how utterly critical the budget is around workforce and continuing professional development. You get so many wins out of it. You get retention out of it, and as I'll shortly talk about, you get skill redesign as well. You need a high-quality workplace. Leadership, of course, is critical, but people practices and the skills and capability around managing people is something that we feel that we crucially need to invest in more. work-life balance, flexibility, shift patterns, and that, of course, all links to our capacity to hold people in the workforce, particularly at the end of career or when they're having a family. Pay and benefits, we have seen the recent welcome hike in pay, and that's been reflected in the findings of the staff survey, but we're nervous with the continuing constraints on funding, despite the sort of headline figures, that will be sort of sustained into the future. And something that perhaps we forget about a bit, but is really important, if you want to attract people to some of the areas we don't traditionally attract them to, viz. Community and rural settings, train them in those settings, and we don't tend to do that. Sorry, I'm clearly not hitting this in the right way. So lastly, from me, the subject that is dear to my heart is the reskilling. So this is not just about numbers. We actually have a reskilling job that applies to every single person in the workforce. The technological change, the fact that we already are sitting on a misalignment between skills and needs means that this is something that applies to everyone. And if we can get it right, it can help us with so many things. It can help us, yes, with bridging gaps, but crucially, it can help us address unmet needs, and we increasingly understand how what matters to patients is often severely unmet by our services, something that Al talks about incredibly eloquently. Improve retention and avoid, so giving people the opportunity to acquire new skills, to develop and enhance. When we did the work on reshaping the workforce, I was so struck by nurses who'd been given the opportunity to go into advanced roles, about how fabulous it was. They had an opportunity to progress that kept them near patients, which is why they were working in nursing in the first place. They didn't have to go into management. It actually can save you money. Some of the boundary spanning roles and giving nurses rehab skills, all these sorts of things can be incredibly helpful in terms of efficiency. And crucially, if you wrap staff and enable them to be wrapped around patients, it can give continuity, which has huge benefits for patients and indeed for staff. But there are things you have to do to enable this. And sorry, this is horribly small print. But the workforce redesign capability is the one that I will pick out. If I could wave a magic wand, I would ensure every single organisation had a team in it that had these skills to help people in the organisation look at patient needs and then align their workforce to those needs. Some of the stuff that Macmillan has been doing with Calderdale is really inspiring in terms of the opportunities there. But we often repeat mistakes in this area and introduce new roles without being really clear what they are. And some of the early feedback from some of the nursing associate stuff is we're still doing it. So it's incredibly important that you invest here. And here's a plug for something that, again, for me, came out of both our work on digital and on reshaping the workforce. When you're doing this workforce redesign, it is part of your overall transformation agenda. So the three things, IT, service redesign, and workforce redesign, need to go hand in hand. And the question was asked earlier, which was never answered, have we got enough service improvement capability? And my own answer would be no. And so an area where this needs to be applied and could be applied, we think, with some success, would be primary care, where actually there's huge opportunities to expand the primary care team, bring other people's skills into it. But do not think you can go on that journey without the investment in redesign. This does not happen by just getting somebody onto your payroll. You've got to think about the pathways, as was being talked about earlier, that they work on. So with that, I'll hand over to Anita.
So I was channeling a young person earlier on, and now I'm channeling my inner Andrew Dilnott. and I'm going to finish with some charts of numbers. And at the moment, they're really to try to elucidate some of the issues that Richard and Candace have started with, but we're going to build on these in our final report towards the end of March. The first thing I really wanted to do was just to show you what's happened over the last 8 years, which is quite a nuanced picture, I think, which holds some of the clues then to Richard's question, where do we start, and some of the clues to why Candace as well has talked about skills and tech. So overall, the workforce in the hospital and community sector has increased by 62,000. That's the red bar in the middle there. That's a 6% increase. Over that same period, activity across the NHS increased by 30%. So that's our productivity gain. But I guess the question is just how sustainable is that? Through this period, the NHS has outperformed productivity across the economy. It's outperformed its own historical rate of productivity. It's done that by working its system phenomenally hard. We've managed to do that for the last 8 years, but it's not clear that actually you could look to productivity savings from the same sources for the coming 5 years, and making the numbers add up in the long-term plan requires that we do continue to generate productivity, but these are rather crude productivity gains. But within that 6% increase in staff, you see an enormously different pattern by staff groups. And in particular, we have got some staff groups that have grown quite substantially. So ambulance staff are the biggest percentage increase, 20% increase. We've had actually really quite a large increase in doctors in the hospital and community sector. And if I'd singled out consultants here, we've actually got a 25% increase in hospital consultants over the last 8 years, which is huge. We've also got an increase in scientific, therapeutic and technical staff. Again, really quite a large increase. But nursing has increased by only 2%. So we've had a 30% increase in activity and a 2% increase in staffing. And obviously, that tells us, I think, where some of the pressure is. It also points, I think, to some of the things that we really need to focus on if we can't do everything. I mean, I think almost nobody thinks that it is sustainable to try to meet increased demand of that sort of rate of growth in the nursing workforce. Yeah? It is our key shortage occupation or group in hospital and community health services. There are also big questions about how well we are managing this very changing dynamic and composition of the team, and whether we've got using technology, are using the skills of that team as well as we can, and moving from a very professional siloed focus towards more team-based focus will be fundamental. That's hospital and community sector. The other big area that we focus on then is GPs. And this is the recent picture since 2015. I've done that because they changed the way the data is calculated. It's a nightmare to do a longer time series. But even through that period, and I think the commitment to increase the number of GPs was made in 2014. Yeah? So it's worth seeing this. There was a commitment to increase the number of GPs by 5,000. Through that period, actually, we've seen a decline. So nursing and GPs, whatever you think about productivity, we don't have enough now. We haven't kept pace over the recent years. And unfortunately, the outlook is that without action, that gets worse. And this is one of these lovely waterfall charts where I've taken the waterfall approach of HEE and run this through. So what you have in the blue line over there is the demand for nurses in England in the last full financial year and the numbers that we had in post. And that gives us a gap of about 32,500 full-time equivalent. That's a lower gap than the NHS improvement numbers you might be familiar with, and that's because I'm adjusting this to NHS digital data. We've got a problem then. If we look then over the next 5 years, combination of people leaving at retirement age, very critically, large numbers, 118,000 leavers under 55 on current leavers rate. That's a huge number. So if you've got that hole in your bucket, yeah, you have to run phenomenally fast in your pipeline of new staff to keep up. And the position there is we've got some domestic joiners and then that pipeline of newly qualified staff. So basically, what we're expecting is that with all the activity that's going on in the moment, we're running to standstill. That the number of nurses that we'll have, leaving aside international recruitment, at the end of the long-term plan period is, broadly speaking, the number we have now, but demand does not stand still. So actually what this amounts to is a doubling in the vacancy gap without serious international recruitment because of the demand pressures. Yeah? So if that is not a burning platform, I have no idea what one is. Yeah? The other thing which I think is pretty clear there is you do not close a gap like that from any one individual intervention. Yeah? And so just to give you a sense of that, if we could get the leavers rate back down to the leavers rate in about 2012, that 118,000 would be about 110,000. So 8,500 nurses, they're worth having. Yeah? Retention really matters, but no individual area is going to get us out of this mess. We're going to have remarkably effective policy action across the piece, and we haven't got a hope without international migration over that 5 years. That was the good news, because then I'm going to talk about GPs. This is quite remarkable, I think. So again, what we look at here is the demand for GPs. It's slightly different. This is in vacancies, is my estimate of the demand for GPs, and how many would need in 18-19. How many we've got, and we've got a gap of about 2,500 at the moment, and that's why it's tough to be a GP now. Again, we've got a significant chunk of retirement, really significant chunk, again, of pre-retirement, these are under 55s leaving, relatively small number of joiners. Actually, we have got, government is right, it's doing quite a lot to increase the number of GPs in training. The trouble is, again, that actually trying to solve this problem just by the pipeline of new GPs is not enough. And so again, what we've got is numbers in post in 23-24, basically the same as numbers in post in 18-19, but enormous demand pressure. And 2,500 GPs short now moves to 7,000 in 5 years' time. And that's an enormous challenge when you think about how long it takes to train a GP. And almost certainly there, this is got to be the wake-up call for really getting serious about a changing move to full-scale team-based care in general practice. So I think the agenda can be overwhelming. To us, it looks like, well, there's a huge amount that needs to happen. Nursing and primary care really stand out as very urgent. Across both of those areas, there is no silver bullet, and we have got to look at the training pipeline, but we've got to look beyond the training pipeline at every lever we can possibly pull. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the three of you. I'm going to open up the discussion with you all very shortly, but before I do that, I'd like to invite representatives from the allied health professions and from nursing to respond to what's been said already and to offer your own thoughts. And can I ask you first, Dame Donna Kinnair from the Royal College of Nursing, to respond to what you've heard and bring us your thoughts.
So I'd like to start by saying, told you so. Told you so. We have been saying this since 2010, when the myth was put out that we had too many nurses in the system. So we have been saying this, and the response has been that we're shroud waving, or as I was recently told, when I said we have got not a chance in hell of delivering the long-term plan without the workforce, that I'm daft. So I don't know who's daft, but I think the system itself is being a bit daft. I think there are a number of interventions, but my biggest worry is that when you've got sustained austerity, you may just have hit a tipping point that money doesn't buy your way out of. So there is this issue that everybody else is pretty blasé about. Yes, we might be able to go overseas and get 25,000 nurses, but so is everybody else going overseas to get thousands of nurses. And we don't have enough in the world, really, to fit everybody's needs. So I'm not even sure if we can buy our way out of this problem by saying to people, because if you're thinking that you've got a shortage, one of the things has to be that you look at increasing supply. And we have not increased supply at all, and yet we want to hold the wage bill. So I think there's some real interventions. Of course we can go overseas. Of course we can focus on the fact that we've got a people business, and actually we may need to enact some things that make nurses and patients feel like they're people so that we can retain them. But I do worry about the tipping point, because actually if you ever are in the workplace at 2 a.m, particularly in ED, it is like a war zone, because you know that you haven't got the people to look after the numbers coming in through the door. So I think there's that. I think there is no way that we can continue without a marked effort to increase our domestic supply. And even then, we're not going to keep up. But it has got to be a big chapter, that, you know, the retention bit, the people bit, and the increase in domestic supply has got to be a focus. You can't just say, well, we'll get better bang for our bucks if we recruit from overseas, because that is not sustainable in the long term. So I think there's something about that. And the technology that we have discussed earlier has got to be a part and parcel. I mean, we don't discuss technology with nurses until we've imposed something and they can't use it. I mean, if I was to tell you about the history I've had in the NHS, from Zion apps that check what you're doing, and nothing has been helpful. So we have to be there at the start of the conversation. And finally, I'd say, because Crystal's in the room and she would never forgive me, but actually cheap education is no education, and we still need that education for our community providers. Now, when I talk about nursing, 60% of my members come from the independent and social care sector, and we still need those skills. But do not forget, at this moment in time, the NHS is the main provider of that, plus overseas recruitment. So unless we build that ability to increase the supply, and I know everyone's saying it won't do it, but we have to make a start. I think if, you know, even the United States recognised that they could no longer go nicking from the rest of the world, they had to put some investment into their domestic supply. So if community services are going to really look after, as we saw Wigan, they still need to be skilled. It's not education on the cheap. So there's no point in coming and saying to me, can we do this cheaply, and not people understand social anthropology and all the other things, inequality in health, and all the other things that go along with providing services to people in the community.
Donna, thank you. And Suzanne, Chief Officer for Allied Health Professions, I suspect you may have some solutions for us.
Well, I'm going to introduce you all to the Alice in Wonderland world of workforce data as it applies to allied health, because Candace and I had the conversation earlier that clearly the presentation made no mention of what is technically the second largest workforce in health and care. So from my perspective, I want to talk to you about three things in that Alice in Wonderland world of eat me, drink me. It might be bigger or smaller than you think. In the sense that bigger, that now there are more registered allied health professionals in England than there are revalidated doctors on the GMC register. And if we boil that down to one of the specific professions of the 14, physiotherapy, there are more physiotherapists in England than there are midwives. And so from my interesting point is why then, in terms of our analytics, our care and policy attention to some of the other workforce areas, Are we not paying similar attention to allied health in our thinking? And I think I'm really wanting to give you some examples now of what that then is meant in terms of consequence. And equally, as Donna has said, some of the levers that we've talked about in policy terms then clearly apply to allied health too. In terms of the smaller than you think, it's shrunk, I'm going to ask you a question now. How many orthotists and prosthetists graduate in England each year? So these are the guys who work with veterans, children, people whose diabetic care has failed, who've got limb loss. So they make limbs for Paralympians, people say who've been in road traffic accidents and the like. How many of them graduate in England each year? Have a guess.
50.
30. And that 30 serve not just England, but Wales, Northern Ireland, and the Republic of Ireland. How can we have let that happen? When I came into post 4 years ago, I started some work with Neil Churchill, who's here today, in terms of patient experience around orthotics, and that work continues. But again, the example of where we've commissioned workforce locally, and I guess one of my concerns as we go into ICSs and STPs, is that where we don't entirely understand all the workforce we've got, whether it's healthcare science or allied health, is that sometimes we end up with the consequences of that inattention and misunderstanding. We also have a number of professions at the moment who, following the removal of the bursary, the numbers, particularly of mature students, have absolutely fallen off a cliff. So those include the prosthetics and orthotics, but also therapeutic radiography, orthoptics, and podiatry, and also ODPs. I mean, I heard this week that we've had 2 operating practitioner department courses at Oxford Brookes University in Surrey, which are both closing. And again, we have a real problem in terms of then, this is a market in terms of HEIs. If they do not have demand from undergraduates wishing to attend those courses, and particularly mature students in the case of those 4 professions that I've highlighted, we do have real problems. And I guess for me, in terms of the thing that keeps me awake at night is around therapeutic radiography. If in terms of the long-term plan, our commitments for cancer treatment, we cannot deliver radiotherapy, that clearly is going to be a serious consequence. So I think bringing me on to the final bit of my 3 points, which is around illusions in the Alice in Wonderland world, is that sometimes because we don't understand what we've got, and as Donna alluded earlier, in advanced practice, we then don't use and utilise the capacity of the workforce to best effect. So if we think about first contact practitioners, particularly in primary care, we developed about a year ago, jointly between Health Education England and NHS England, Armour and Skills for Health, a framework for first contact practitioners in musculoskeletal care. And that wasn't just physiotherapy, it was osteopathy and podiatry. And I know Nikita Kanai from NHS England is here as Acting Director of Primary Care. And when we were talking to colleagues about the current GP or the new GP contract and thinking about directly enhanced services, we were able to bring forward support from physiotherapy and paramedic colleagues, but when we were thinking about other support, that didn't land at this particular time. And is it because we don't understand the offer that dietetics and occupational therapy, podiatry and osteopathy might make in that setting? And I think sometimes, again, it's how we think about and utilise the workforce that we've got. It won't make up the gaps, but I think sometimes there is something about that capacity. And the final 2 general points for me, I guess, is in policy terms around system levers. If we are doing something in terms of a system lever, thinking about retention or undergraduate attraction, something of that sort, CPD, international recruitment, it has to be consistent. At the moment, the visa cap has been lifted from medical and nursing colleagues. It has not been lifted from allied health, and we are beginning to see particular problems in terms of international recruitment. And the final issue for me, which came back from the previous presentation, was around the Green Paper. I represent over 171,000 AHPs across 14 professions who clearly practice not just in the NHS, but social care, housing, criminal justice, education. And the issue for me is that in terms of the workforce improvement plan that Richard spoke about earlier, that clearly the NHS component of that will be addressed, but I know Anita has said elsewhere, we've talked about the porosity of the workforce and the fact that clearly in terms of careers, people's family lives, that they move between settings. And it's it's really important for me in terms of workforce policy and planning that we think about that contextually in the whole. And I'm sure, I hope the Green Paper will also consider some of the responses in relation to allied health, in addition to that from the NHS Workforce Improvement Plan.
Thank you. Donna and Suzanne, thank you both very much indeed. I'm going to open the discussion out to you all now. So if I can have a show of hands. Thank you. Right, start here, right at the front. That's Richard, I think, isn't it? Yes. And then afterwards go to Nick, and then the person behind can't quite make... Is that Anne-Marie?
Yeah.
Yes. So 1, 2, 3 to start with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Richard Parrish from the newly established National Centre for Rural Health and Care. I think the one thing that's dispiriting that comes from these excellent presentations is the fact that many of us have been saying that this was going to be the problem for the last 10 to 20 years. And it actually started way back even before that, in around 1991, 92, when we introduced the whole concept of educational commissioning. So it goes back, it has its genesis way, way back. Virtually all aspects of delivery are more complicated in rural areas and more difficult than they are in urban areas. And this applies equally to the whole issue of workforce, where both recruitment and retention are more problematical. I'd like to ask the panel's view about a slightly different way of perhaps trying to solve this issue in the longer term. Virtually all the health professions use a fairly traditional academic model these days for training their people. And we know in rural areas, it is the more academically able young people who leave, go off to the major cities, train, frequently don't come back. There is nothing to suggest that many of the people who aren't particularly academic aren't just as intellectually able and just as able to learn. They just have different learning styles. And I'd like the panel's view about what potential there might be in an apprenticeship model operating in particularly rural areas, but it could apply elsewhere. I realize that that makes additional demands upon practitioners locally in the first instance, but it does open up a larger pool of potential people to recruit into the healthcare professions.
Great. We'll take the next two questions, and I'll bring the panel in a cluster.
Thanks. Nick Black, London School of Hygiene. We've got two main themes today. Clearly, workforce is a major one, but the other is fairly radical, sustainable transformation of health and social care. To what extent are the sort of workforce models and ideas that we've heard rather stuck in the existing way that we think about health and social care? And is it actually possible to do any serious planning until we see those radical transformations take place, which might actually be part of the solution? I mean, I'm really anxious about this repeated message about the predicted demand in 5 years' time. How do we know what the demand on health and social care is if we're going to transform the whole way we think about how we respond to public's health and care needs?
Okay. And Anne-Marie?
Thank you very much. Anne-Marie Rafferty, RCM President and King's College London. Anita, you talked about leavers in particular, not the people who are leaving the professions, but L-E-V-E-R-S.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you had given some thought to the levers that we might be able to apply or, of course, restore to the burning platform profession of nursing, for example, which, of course, we have lost. And one of the challenges is that we have fewer levers than we had before to actually turn around and transform the situation as Nick would ideally like. So what would your levers be that you would wish to put in place? And both Candace and you spoke about teams, and perhaps this is partly what lies behind Nick's question as well. How much store can we set by teams? Or are we just deluding ourselves in another version of Suzanne's Alice in Wonderland? Is team going to be the ticket that will transform?
Great, thank you. Can I start with Anita and Candace? Perhaps the rural apprenticeships and the levers would fit together.
I think the apprentice point is really well made. And what I would say, I think, is that there are two things that we really need to think about here. One is that the research evidence from around the world looking at attempts to deal with recruitment in geographies where that's difficult, and rural is a big part of that, is it's incredibly difficult to pay people to go to somewhere that they don't want to go to. And so what seems to be more sustainable is to try to think about how to skill up and support the people and the assets that are in the community where it's hard to serve. So this is why things like training, thinking about where we put training places, both in terms of geography, but also the type of services that people are exposed to and they're confident to work in, is really important. The other thing linked to that, thinking about apprenticeships and different routes in, where the standard is no different at the end, but the route, and that's a really important point, the route to get to that standard is different, is the extent to which we still have a set of professions that reflect the communities that they serve, and the enormous asset that comes both for healthcare and for communities in ensuring that the workforce does reflect the diversity of the community that it serves. So I think that's really important. It's not in the quick fix bucket, you know. So one of the challenges here is balancing off, we have a burning platform, we have to do a load of quick fix stuff. At the same time, we're in this mess because we never think about the longer term. And we never think properly about really what does it take to not just have enough staff, but really support those staff to engage in designing and developing new models of care, implementing those. And I think Donna's point, which is really well made, about not designing them elsewhere and then imposing them on people, but really involving them in that. And then you think, well, but actually, how can you begin to do that unless you've got enough? Because at the moment, you know, people are only just getting to the end of the day if they're lucky, let alone then going and spending a load of time on the redesign. I think the answer around team would say two things about that. I think all of the work that I've seen on service delivery for the future does emphasise that multi-professional working is really important. At the same time, one of the things that we were talking about in the earlier session that Candace chaired was that actually for individuals, relationships really matter. And if team meets fragmentation and multiplicity and not having a clue who's actually in charge and not being able to have that clear and continuous relationship, then that would be a step backwards. So actually what that points to is getting team right is really difficult. And one of my concerns about some of the ways in which we're approaching the transformation agenda on primary care and general practice is we're very focused on things like the structures of networks and then making sure there are different professions in, but actually who's coordinating and learning how you make that genuinely a team and how you make sure that that really works for patients so that the right person has the right contact and the right relationships, and that's appropriately nuanced for different people. We're going to do that 8,000, I mean, there will be 8,000 practices, 8,000 times over. So how are we going to learn about that? Which comes to actually, you cannot do, well, you can do, but it doesn't work very well, because that's what we have done, workforce planning and service redesign in parallel universes. You know, so we should take that if these two things aren't properly integrated, we're unlikely to be successful in either.
Candace, do you want to add to that?
So so Anita has picked off all three, so I will pick off all three. So the sort of apprenticeship model and the rurality, I mean, I completely agree. And one of the things that worries me when we take services out of rural areas is the impact it has on that local community. So you get a real win-win if you're drawing from that local community and giving them skills and enabling them. Of course, we know at the moment the apprenticeships are not working ideally. Some places are making them work well, but actually the restriction of the levy only being focused on training as opposed to backfill causes people problems, and clearly some people feel more confident with it than others, so it needs greater flexibility to work well. It is interesting, when we were doing our work on acute medicine, we had some really inspiring presentations from people in much more challenged ruralities than ours, so Canada and Australia, about what they had done, and actually realising that different skills might be needed in those areas to the skills that you need in urban areas. So I think that's the huge opportunity for then having training embedded in those areas, that you'll then give skills that are appropriate to that place. Nick's point, and it's one that I have sort of played with in my own head multiple times, which is, if we don't know what the service model is in the future, how in hell's name do we plan for that? And where I come back to is, we do know that we will need skilled staff, and actually skilled staff are much more pluripotential than we have so far given them credibility for. So the wonderful things that are going on in places where nurses, as I alluded to it, are being given some of the therapeutic skills, so if they build in therapy and rehab as part of the way that they do their work, really some of the boundary spanning things. So for my money, we have to go for it in terms of getting this professional pipeline, but we also have to go for it in terms of giving people the skills and capability to adapt that pipeline as they come off it, and also think about it as in terms of their training as they go through. And on teams, which again I've done a lot of work in a previous life, I had two sets of experience of it. One leading the work on the hospital at night teams, which was very challenging because they're not real teams. They come together and go away again. But also the establishment of the original community mental health teams. And my learning from both of those was it requires investment, which was Anita's point really. These do not happen by magic. You don't, and this was the thing that destroyed me, I have to say, when I watched how Hospital at Night got panned out or implemented, was that basically hospitals said whoever's in the hospital at night is my hospital at night team. That is not how teams work. They need leaders, they need clarity of roles and responsibilities, they need absolutely clarity of objectives, and for teams that are handing off from one time period to another, the handoff is an absolutely critical part of it. So there's all sorts of stuff that makes teams work, but when they do work, there is good evidence that they bring real benefits. So I would see teams as being a key part of the answer.
I think these first three questions touch on so many issues. I'm going to bring everybody in. So Richard, would you like to come?
Yeah, I think the one I'd particularly like to pick up is the issue around uncertainty, both around transforming change, but also, of course, around digital as well. And I've also had the pushback, won't digital completely change the nature of the workforce going forward? If you look back over the history of the NHS, and probably even before it, alongside the puzzle of why we can't seem to work out how to fund social care, is why are we always over-optimistic on how few clinical staff we need? We've made the same mistake over and over and over again, and we're right in it now. Either that we don't think we can't really afford the NHS, so let's keep the number of staff down, and being wildly optimistic about the productivity assumption, or that some kind of miraculous productivity change will happen through some technology we haven't quite yet identified. There's a balance of risk between training too few and training too many. And I just lodge again with people, as I say, the English tendency is always to train too few. Now, you might be able to get away with doing that sometimes if you can recruit from overseas. And again, I'm old enough to have been in the department trying to struggle with the disappearance of GPs in East London, because all the Indian GPs they'd recruited in the 1960s when they didn't train enough were all heading towards retirement age. This is a recurrent problem. I can't remember a time when we've sat here, in either in this room or in other ones, terribly worried about mass unemployment in clinical staff. So I'm not sure how realistic that risk is, particularly, go back to Andrew Dilnot's slide at the start. There is a surge, wonderfully, because our life expectancy has gone up, in the number of older people. Older people are not necessarily ill, but there is a tendency at some point that they will need more healthcare, and we're not having a lot of success yet in dealing with multimorbidity and the spreading of things like obesity and other health problems. So alongside some optimism around transforming care, transforming how people experience services through digital technology, is an underlying surge in demand, which is exactly why Japan, Germany, and all the other countries are also looking for additional staff as well. So I probably lean back towards what Candace said, which is I'd probably train them, get them, and let's try and ensure that there's enough flexibility available through CPD, through the way that they've been brought into the workforce, so that if demand has fundamentally changed, then we can use them in a different way, and they've still got viable and interesting careers to hold.
Thank you. And Suzanne and Donna, would you like to?
I guess the issue for me was around the issue of radical models in terms of teams. And I guess one of the things that we tend to do is we think, well, we're short of this, let's knit some more of them, rather than thinking about starting with the citizen in terms of what is it that they need from us in terms of skills and competencies, and actually working back from there. Because I guess I'm coming towards the end of my career, and when I trained 30 odd years ago, if we think about learning disabilities in terms of, I trained in a unit where people were basically incarcerated in the beautiful countryside, and medication was used to manage some of the behaviours, which is clearly inappropriate and would not happen now. But nonetheless, we've moved to a community model for those citizens, but actually we've still, in some senses, tailing the same workforce model with that group of citizens that we had 30 years ago. And I would suggest that actually we really need to think about what are the skills and competencies that we need for situations, rather than thinking what is it that we've always done.
Thank you. And Donna?
I'd just like to pick up the rural training bit, because one of the things that you kind of need to do is, if you can't get the population to come to you, you need to go to the population. So the RCN has just been working on a programme of how we train nurses in rural Wales in order for them to stay in Wales and be employed in Wales. Because we know that they don't, you can actually do it. So it's one of the things that the Prince of Wales asked the Royal College of Nursing to do, and we're just about to launch that in June. So we've got a whole model of training that takes numbers from rural Wales, gives them healthcare assistant jobs as they have a bursary as well, but also helps them educate in their communities. So that's something we're going to launch in June. And I can tell you a bit more about that. But on Nick, I've never done transformation without adequate numbers of people. And so it's quite hard to do transformation. And if you do transformation with a leaking bucket, you're not going to achieve it. And I think there's something about, let's be real. I mean, my biggest beef is that we don't know still who's in charge of workforce in the NHS. I still don't know. I've got a long-term plan that says what we need, but actually I write to every single one of the heads of the ALBs and they say, try the other one. So I'm a bit concerned about accountability for workforce, and you know that this is something the RCN is very, very vexed about, because we've had that little joke where we've suppressed the numbers in training, we've suppressed the pay, we've suppressed everything, and then nobody is responsible. Every ALB is responsible. And when you've got, diffuse responsibility, there's no one that's accountable. So, but I don't think I've ever done transformation of any service without adequate numbers. So we do still, and I agree with you, we will always need clinically skilled people. And if Anne-Marie was sitting here, she says the better skilled you are, the more flexible you become. So in a system where we're suppressing CPD monies and we're not giving people opportunity, we aren't going to have that advantage of being able to flex our workforce. So if you always deprive people of the skills and you're just doing the very basic, you're not going to be covering the skills and competencies we need for the future. And that includes our technical skills as well.
Thank you. I'm going to go to this side of the room now. That one. Thank you. Go ahead.
Sure. Kieran Walsh from the University of Manchester. This has been the most depressing session of the day.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
And it's depressing because it's really brought home the scale of the workforce problem, but also the way that problem has been made in government by Treasury policy around pensions, by the ill-thought-through raiding of education budgets to bail out the NHS over recent years, by the ill-thought-through shift from bursaries to loans and other policies. I think it's really great that the think tanks have got together to do this piece of analytic work, but as I was listening to it, I was thinking, why hasn't Health Education England been doing this work? Why haven't they been doing more to build the evidence base for research and innovation in workforce planning and workforce design? And I almost feel there should have been a kind of seventh empty chair on the platform to represent HEE's contribution to this. So my question for the panel is Health Education England a significant part of the problem here? Does it need reform? And if so, what would they do?
I think we'll take responses to that very direct question, and then we'll see. We may have time for one more, we may not. Let's see how we go. Who wants to kick off with the poison? I've bowled you a curveball. I'll get to Richard. He's on the end. Or are you going there, Anita?
Are you going to go?
Donna said has been writing around to ALBs trying to get attention on the workforce crisis. When we did our piece just in the autumn, which was quite critical. I mean, it's here are the problems we really need to get sorted. As we went around the ALBs, they all said, brilliant, really great job. And as you walk around, you realise that none of them thought we were talking about them. It's true, HE holds some of the levers. They don't have any levers on pay. I think their levers over retention aren't very great. And if other ALBs don't listen to them, there's not a lot that you can do. So rather than point to, because I would fear thinking that you could change one of the ALBs, when in fact what we've got to try and find is joint responsibility with real responsibility and accountability behind it. Doesn't over-centralise, because of course one of the things we might do is we try and create something at national level, you then disempower local level. And what we probably haven't said about enough today is how much of this really needs to be done by organisations on the ground, whether it's all the way down to a GP practice or all the way up to a foundation trust, and how much actually rests with them, is to try and sort that out at national level, because somebody clearly wasn't making the case strongly enough to Treasury. So, as you say, some policies have been made that have not helped. What's odd is that they haven't then got changed. Part of this seems to be, as Donna said, if you've been talking about it since 2010, I think our three organisations have been talking about it for quite a while as well. You sometimes felt we were just talking into echo chambers.
Richard, thank you for that. I'm going to go straight to another question. Right over there. Yes, thank you. Sorry, I can't see you very well from here.
Ian.
Thank you, Ian Dodge, NHS England. And it was just a quick comment, picking up on Kieran's point about how depressing this session has been. And rather than us all kind of topping ourselves, here's just a few causes for optimism, notwithstanding the fact we've got a huge gap and we clearly need to train shed loads more people. So in just a few weeks, the Daily Mail got over 33,000 people signed up to be volunteers in Helpforce, just like that, massive untapped resource. Alf Collins is here. We're doing real work around patients actually as providers through patient activation. To answer Donna's question around accountability, I do think the Dido-led process that's going on at the moment, which is really big and inclusive, is a deliberate attempt to try and provide a bit of glue to the absolute mess of the different accountabilities in the system. On team redesign, if you look at the data on the new care models, we have effectively helped to reduce emergency demand by a statistically significant amount, and a lot of that is through different team working, going after the high-need, high-cost patients. On international recruitment, we know that loads of people around the world would love to train in the UK. Actually, Healthcare UK, we could really help do, if we could get the immigration numbers right, the universities would love to expand, actually, their training places. There is the supply wanting to be there. There are certain workforce groups that we massively underutilise. Pharmacists, incredibly well-skilled folk. Actually, we could do a load more and are planning to do so. On team-based working in primary care, there is a huge OD programme, picking up on your challenge, Anita, and quite a lot of cash behind that. to try and drive it not at the 7,000 practices, but at the 1,000 networks backed by the ICSs. James Morrow's just in front of me. There are 94 practices in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough STP, but there will only be 14, we think, networks, actually backed by the 40-odd different ICSs. There is a scale to try and really help practically with that redesign. Technology, I think we're absolutely right, we haven't driven it, and I think there are some chinks of light from the Treasury around possible pension reform, maybe just copying the local government partial pension scheme. So yes, it is all a disaster, but there are some, there are some grounds for optimism.
Ian, thank you very much. And oh my goodness me, we are running out of time. We've one more, I think, and then we must close. Yes, there we are in the middle. Yes, you.
Hello, I think some in the audience might be pleased to know that I want to move us on a little bit. It's Naomi Chambers, also from the University of Manchester. I want to ask a completely different question, which was, to what extent in your work did you look at the different challenges that different areas face in terms of recruitment and retention? Because we know that sometimes some of the poorest neighbourhoods, some of the poorest areas, and some of our most challenged hospitals find it that much harder to recruit and retain doctors and nurses, both in the hospital sector and also in the primary sector. There are huge differences, and just very curious to know whether your work went in that direction as well.
Okay. Anita?
Yeah, so we haven't looked in detail at the issue of distribution across the country. You're absolutely right, though. And I think one of the things that points to, which picks up partly as well, Kieran's point, is that whatever you do nationally, actually these issues are also profoundly local. And actually there are different levels of local for different staff groups. And so one of the things that we need to do is obviously improve national policy making and coordination on the workforce. But we also need to think through how we're going to get better work going on locally. And a number of people, I think, would argue, and one challenge here is just how many people you need to involve in that. So, links between the NHS and higher education are patchy. Yeah, you do that on one geography. You go for a service, slightly different service model. You need to work with the higher education institutes then about the training pipeline. One's keen, one's less keen. They're focused on different issues. You need to be able to coordinate that. And then, of course, for some areas as well, it's your FE colleges that are really profoundly important. And the other thing we're all thinking about, and was clear in the plan, was the role of the NHS as anchor institutions, and thinking that we need staff not just to provide services, but we need to think as well, and this morning we're fantastically talking about that whole Wigan example, about the extent to which the way that we employ people contributes to the health and vitality of a community or undermines it. And 1 in 4 people on a 0 hours contract works in the health and social care sector. Yeah? And so our terms and conditions are important not just for our ability to get staff, but that local understanding is really important. But the skills and capacity to do that across all the country and understand that nuance and build those relationships is a work in progress.
Anita, thank you.